It looked like nothing more than a beautiful wedding portrait. A bride, dressed in white lace, her veil cascading in delicate folds across her shoulders. A groom at her side, stiff with pride. The studio's backdrop painted with soft flowers, the furniture arranged just so. It was a timeless moment, captured in 1912, the kind of picture families treasure for generations. For over a century, the photograph sat tucked away in an album, passed down quietly through relatives, admired only for its vintage charm. At first glance, it was ordinary, harmless, a symbol of love. But photographs, like memories, are never as simple as they seem. Because when experts zoomed in on this particular image, they uncovered something chilling. Something that no one in 1912 could have possibly imagined. It wasn't just the lacework of the veil. It wasn't just a trick of the light. Hidden in the folds, faint but undeniable, were faces. Faces that didn't belong. Faces of men who should have been long gone. Men who were supposed to be resting beneath the earth. And as the details emerged, so too did the horrifying story behind them. This wasn't just a wedding portrait. This was a photograph of betrayal, of death, of a woman who carried ghosts into her marriage, and who believed she would never be caught. The bride's name was Clara Whitmore. At least, that's the name history thought she carried. In truth, her name had changed many times, and with each new identity came another husband, another fortune, another grave. On that wedding day in 1912, she wasn't simply celebrating her vows. She was hiding a secret life, a life of lies, of poison, of stolen wealth. And the veil, the very symbol of purity, had betrayed her. It reflected the truth she thought was buried. One photograph had captured everything. One image revealed more than a century of whispered suspicions, forgotten obituaries, and unexplained deaths. But how did a single picture expose the truth about one of the most cunning killers of her era? How could a veil, a piece of fabric, hold evidence powerful enough to rewrite history? To answer that, we must step back, to the quiet towns of New England, to the lives of the men she charmed, to the tragedies that followed wherever she went, and to the trail of secrets that would eventually lead to this one haunting portrait. Because behind Clara's smile was not joy, it was triumph. She believed she had won, but history and a single photograph would prove her wrong. To understand why this wedding portrait is unlike any other, we first need to know who Clara was, and the world in which she lived. The year was 1912. America was perched on the edge of transformation. The old Victorian world of rigid manners and corsets was fading, replaced by a modern century of machines, moving pictures, and restless ambition. The Titanic had just sunk, shocking the globe. Women were beginning to raise their voices for the right to vote, demanding freedom and recognition. And in towns across New England, life balanced between tradition and change. It was in this atmosphere that Clara's story began. To her neighbors, she was refined, graceful, and educated. She knew how to walk into a room with elegance, how to speak just enough to charm, but never enough to draw suspicion. Her reputation was carefully constructed, like the layers of lace she wore in that wedding portrait. But beneath the surface, Clara carried secrets. She was not born into wealth. Far from it. She had grown up in modest circumstances, watching others rise while her own family scraped by. She learned early that beauty could open doors, that a soft smile could unlock opportunities that hard work alone could never grant. In a society that gave women few options beyond marriage, she discovered a dangerous truth. Marriage could become her business. The early 20th century was not kind to women with ambition. A respectable woman was expected to marry once, devote herself to home and children, and disappear quietly into domestic life. But Clara had no intention of vanishing into obscurity. She wanted comfort, she wanted freedom, and she wanted power. And so she turned to the most available currency she had, herself. Men noticed her. Older men, wealthier men, men who saw her as a prize they could possess. Clara played the part they expected. The devoted companion, the soft-spoken admirer, the ideal bride. But behind her eyes, calculations were always running. She studied their estates, their accounts, their habits. She paid attention to their weaknesses, The cough that lingered, the reliance on a glass of brandy before bed, the trust they placed in their doctors. And soon, one by one, her marriages began to follow a familiar pattern. A whirlwind romance, a swift wedding, a period of apparent happiness. Then illness, unexpected decline, and death. The grieving widow, dressed in black, accepted condolences with tears in her eyes. And then inheritance, always inheritance. In a time when death from disease was common, suspicion rarely clung to her. Doctors signed certificates of heart failure, pneumonia, or stroke. No one imagined that the delicate woman weeping at the graveside might have placed the poison herself. By 1912, Clara had already lived several lives under several names. She was no longer simply a woman searching for stability. She was a predator in silk gloves. And with each new husband, she grew bolder, more confident, more certain that she could never be caught. But Clara was not alone in her world. To truly understand how she moved undetected, we must meet the people who surrounded her, the characters who would unknowingly become part of her deadly play. The studio portrait captured more than a bride and her veil. Frozen in that black and white image were the people who formed the cast of Clara's final and most daring performance. To the casual eye, they were simply relatives, attendants, and one very proud groom. But each had a role in the quiet drama that was about to unfold. At the center stood Thomas Whitmore, the groom. He was 42, a successful businessman in textiles, with investments stretching across Boston and New York. Respectable, wealthy, and eager to begin a new life with the woman who had enchanted him. In the photograph, Thomas looks proud, almost too proud, his posture stiff, his chest pushed forward as if to display his new prize to the world. His friends described him as generous but somewhat naive, a man who believed the best of others, even when he should not. Clara had chosen him well. Beside them were members of Thomas's family. His sister, Margaret Whitmore, stood to the side in a dark dress, her expression guarded. She had doubts, though she could not yet name them. Clara seemed too perfect, too polished. Margaret worried about how quickly the courtship had moved, how Thomas seemed spellbound in a way she had never seen before. But she kept her concerns quiet, because what family questions love on a wedding day? Behind the couple stood two men in suits, family friends, witnesses to the union. Their faces reveal little, but history would later note how one of them remembered Clara's composure. She was calm, he said decades later. Calm in a way that did not fit the occasion. Most brides trembled, laughed nervously, dabbed their eyes. She did none of these. The photographer himself, though unseen in the portrait, played an important part. Samuel Grayson was known for his meticulous work. He arranged the studio with precision. The heavy velvet drapes, the painted garden backdrop, the chaise on which Clara leaned. His lens was sharp, his exposure long. It was his careful craft that allowed the strange reflections to be preserved in the veil. Without him, the evidence might have been lost forever. And then there was Clara herself, the true center of everything. In the portrait, she is stunning. Her gown cascades in folds of lace, her veil drawn delicately across her shoulders. Her smile is slight, almost secretive. Where Thomas beams, she merely holds her expression, as though posing for a role she had long rehearsed. Her eyes catch the light differently than the others, harder, sharper. Those who see the image today often remark that her face seems to know something the others do not. Together, they created a tableau of celebration, a memory preserved for family and history. But behind the smiles, suspicion lingered. Behind the lace, secrets waited. Every character captured in that frame had a part to play, though only one knew the true script. It was in the days that followed this portrait that something unusual was noticed. Something small, but enough to unravel the illusion Clara had so carefully built. The portrait hung in Thomas and Clara's home for only a short while before people began to whisper. At first, it was nothing more than idle talk. Someone at a dinner party remarked that the photograph felt unsettling. Another said the bride's veil seemed to carry a shadow. Most brushed it off as the tricks of old photography. Blurred exposures, imperfections in glass plates. But one evening, Thomas's sister Margaret stood in front of the portrait longer than usual. She leaned in close, squinting at the folds of lace draped across Clara's shoulder. Something was there. Not lace, not shadow, shapes, faint but unmistakable. A cluster of outlines that looked disturbingly like faces. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. She stepped back, blinked, and looked again. The faces remained, pale, almost spectral, as if caught in reflection. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Whose faces were they? Why did they seem so familiar? She said nothing to Thomas. He was too infatuated, too proud of his new bride. But the detail gnawed at her. Quietly, she showed the photograph to a friend, a neighbor. Each time, the reaction was the same: unease. Some claimed they could see eyes staring back. Others swore they recognized expressions, male faces, older, stern. One woman whispered that it looked like the dead peering through the veil of the living. Word spread cautiously, as such things always do in tightly bound communities. The Whitmore wedding portrait became a subject of hushed speculation. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others suggested a technical mishap. Perhaps the photographer had reused a plate, leaving ghostly remnants of an earlier exposure. But the truth was far darker. For in those blurred outlines were not accidents of light, but echoes of Clara's past. Though no one yet knew it, the faces belonged to men who had once stood at Clara's side as husbands. Men who had fallen ill, who had wasted away under her watchful care, and who had all left their fortunes to the grieving widow. The veil had betrayed her. Its sheen had captured more than the glow of the studio lamps. In the long exposure, it had mirrored fragments of photographs Clara had once carried with her, hidden inside her belongings. Old images of her former husbands, pressed close to her on that day, imprinted themselves onto the fabric's reflection. And so, the wedding portrait became more than a keepsake. It became a riddle, a puzzle piece no one could solve in 1912. A photograph that demanded to be studied again and again, as though it refused to keep its secrets. The whispers about the portrait might have faded into obscurity, if not for what happened next. A tragedy that turned speculation into certainty. The whispers about Clara's portrait might have remained nothing more than unsettling gossip, until tragedy struck. Barely 6 months after the wedding, Thomas Whitmore fell ill. At first, it was subtle, cough that lingered, a heaviness in his chest. Clara, ever the devoted bride, insisted on tending to him herself. Neighbors noted how attentive she was, how she never left his side, how she personally prepared his meals and poured his nightly glass of brandy. But Thomas's condition worsened quickly. Within weeks he grew frail, his once powerful frame reduced to weakness. His hands trembled as he lifted a spoon, his speech slurred with exhaustion. The town physician diagnosed pneumonia, then later suggested a heart ailment. Each prescription seemed to do little more than delay the inevitable. Margaret, his sister, grew frantic. She urged Thomas to seek another doctor, even a specialist in Boston. But Clara resisted. "He's too weak to travel," she said softly, with tears in her eyes. "I can care for him here. No one loves him as I do." Her words soothed Thomas, who trusted her completely. He reassured his sister, insisting Clara's devotion was proof of her goodness. But behind closed doors, Margaret noticed details. Clara measuring powders before adding them to Thomas's tea. Clara insisting on being the only one to serve his food. The bitter smell that sometimes lingered in his room, sharp and unfamiliar. Then came the night when Thomas cried out in pain, his body seizing, his muscles twisting in spasms so violent that Margaret, standing outside the door, heard the bed frame strike the floorboards. Clara screamed for the doctor, but by the time he arrived, Thomas was gone. The official cause of death, heart failure. It was quick, tragic, and not entirely uncommon for men in their 40s. The town mourned him deeply, but the photograph, already a subject of quiet speculation, suddenly took on a more sinister significance. People remembered the faces in the veil. They remembered the unease. And now Thomas was dead. Margaret, in her grief, began to connect the pieces. The photo, the whispers, Clara's insistence on controlling every aspect of Thomas's care. And most disturbing of all, the will. Just weeks before his illness, Thomas had rewritten it, leaving nearly everything to Clara. His sister received only a token inheritance. For Margaret, the suspicion hardened into fear. The portrait had not only captured a moment of joy, but also a prophecy of death. Thomas's death left Clara a wealthy widow once again. But while she wore her mourning clothes, not everyone was convinced of her innocence, and one person in particular vowed to uncover the truth. The funeral was somber, attended by townsfolk who respected Thomas Whitmore and pitied his young widow. Clara stood at the graveside dressed in black crepe, her veil drawn low, her face pale with grief. She wept softly, her handkerchief damp with carefully timed tears. To the community, she was the picture of sorrow, a woman cruelly robbed of her husband again. But behind the curtain of mourning, events moved quickly. Within days, Clara petitioned the court to execute Thomas's will. It left nearly the entire estate to her, including his business holdings, real estate, and financial accounts. Margaret was left with only keepsakes and a small allowance. To outsiders, this seemed natural. Thomas had adored Clara, and widows needed security. But to Margaret, it felt deliberate, almost calculated. She began to ask questions. Why had Thomas changed his will so recently? Why had Clara been so insistent on overseeing his care alone? Why did the physician never order a second opinion, despite the severity of his symptoms? Her doubts grew louder, even as others urged her to leave the matter be. Yet in 1912, suspicion of a woman, especially one as composed and graceful as Clara, was difficult to prove. Poison left little trace, and doctors were reluctant to contradict their own diagnoses. Clara knew this. She had relied on it before. Still, Margaret could not silence the image of the portrait. Each time she looked at it, her brother's lifeless face seemed reflected in those strange shadows of the veil. She began to believe the photograph was not just unsettling, but prophetic, a visual warning of Clara's hidden crimes. Meanwhile, Clara wasted no time stepping into her new role. She dismissed some of Thomas's old associates, sold off a portion of his business interests, and moved into a grander home. Her composure never wavered, even as whispers circled. To those who confronted her with subtle hints of suspicion, she replied with gentle dignity, "I have suffered enough. Must I now endure gossip as well?" Her ability to turn accusation into sympathy was uncanny. Yet, in the midst of this careful performance, something began to shift. Margaret's persistence caught the attention of a Boston investigator named Richard Hale. Known for his sharp eye and unwillingness to be swayed by appearances, Hale agreed to quietly look into the matter. He started with the portrait. He studied the strange outlines, the faces that should not have been there. Then he examined Thomas's medical records, the doctor's notes, the new will. Each piece seemed innocent alone. Together, they formed a troubling picture. Clara believed herself untouchable. She had wealth, charm, and the protection of society's expectations. But Hale's interest meant her carefully woven story was beginning to unravel. The deeper Hale looked, the more contradictions he found, and each one brought him closer to a shocking truth hidden not just in the veil, but in Clara's entire life. Richard Hale was not the sort of man easily swayed by appearances. Where others saw a grieving widow cloaked in dignity, he saw patterns, details too sharp to ignore. His first clue lay in the portrait itself. He examined it under magnification, tracing the delicate folds of Clara's veil. The faces were not simple shadows. They were distinct, layered, and too defined to be dismissed as chance. Who were these men? Why did their ghostly outlines appear in the bride's lace? Hale began tracing Clara's past. He requested records from towns where she had once lived, quietly writing letters and combing through newspapers. What he uncovered startled even him. Clara Whitmore was not Clara Whitmore at all. She had been Clara Dawson in one town, Clara Middleton in another, and even once gone by the name of Clara Hoffman. Each name was tied to a marriage certificate, and each marriage certificate was followed, within a year or two, by an obituary. Husbands who had died of sudden illnesses, husbands who left estates that curiously transferred almost entirely to her. The pattern repeated itself like a grim refrain: vows, illness, death, inheritance. But the contradictions deepened further. In some towns, neighbors recalled how Clara appeared barely in mourning before she departed with her fortune. In others, whispers suggested doctors had found symptoms inconsistent with natural causes. One remembered the bitter smell of almonds in a husband's room, a telltale sign of poison. Another recalled her insistence that no one else prepare meals. When Hale compared these accounts with Thomas Whitmore's death, the similarities were chilling. The sudden decline, the tremors, the seizures, the will changed in her favor. Clara's hand was not visible, but her influence was everywhere. The portrait itself began to feel like more than a keepsake. It was evidence. Hale theorized that Clara had carried photographs of her past husbands with her, tokens of control, perhaps even trophies. During the long studio exposure, those images may have reflected faintly into the sheen of her veil. Whether accidental or deliberate, the result was damning. Her past bleeding into her present, exposing her crimes in plain sight. Yet still, Hale faced obstacles. The law was hesitant to pursue a woman of means and reputation. Poisoning was notoriously hard to prove without modern forensics. And Clara, aware of the whispers, doubled down on her performance of sorrow. She made generous donations to the church. She hosted gatherings where she spoke kindly of Thomas. She even befriended Margaret, as though attempting to soothe her suspicions. But Hale pressed on. Piece by piece, the contradictions mounted. Too many names, too many graves, too many wills rewritten in her favor. Clara's story was unraveling, and with it, the careful image she had cultivated. And yet, even as the evidence piled higher, questions remained. Was Clara merely a cunning widow, or something far darker? Theories began to emerge, each more unsettling than the last. The deeper Richard Hale looked, the more unsettling the portrait of Clara became. Not the painted studio backdrop, not the smile carefully poised for the camera, but the portrait of her life itself. Her story was no longer that of a tragic widow. It was a pattern, and patterns never lie. But how had she done it, and why? The first theory was greed. Each marriage enriched her. Each husband left behind property, businesses, or savings that flowed neatly into her possession. In a time when women's economic independence was rare, Clara had found a way to turn the social expectation of marriage into her personal business empire. To some, she was simply a cold opportunist who saw husbands as stepping stones. Yet Hale suspected there was more. He spoke to acquaintances from her earlier lives who described her as disinterested in money, but fascinated by control. One recalled how Clara kept photographs of her past husbands in a locked drawer. Another claimed she spoke, almost wistfully, of how fleeting trust was between men and women. To Hale, this suggested something darker than greed. Perhaps power was her true obsession. Power to hold life and death in her hands. The veil itself became central to another theory. Forensic experts of the day speculated that during the long exposure of the studio portrait, light reflected not just from the lamps but from surfaces Clara herself carried. Was it possible she had hidden photographs of her deceased husbands within her bouquet, or pinned within her dress? That the camera captured their faint images, blending them into the fabric of her veil? If true, this was more than accident, it was ritual, a way of carrying the ghosts of her past into her new union. Some even whispered that Clara was not just a poisoner but a collector of memories. She preserved the faces of her victims like trophies, trapped in photographs, hidden in albums. The portrait, then, was her ultimate mistake, a private shrine accidentally exposed to the world. Theories about her methods were equally grim. Arsenic was common, easy to purchase in those years, sold as rat poison in any pharmacy. Administered carefully, it mimicked natural illness, tremors, vomiting, seizures, eventual collapse. It left little trace in the era before advanced toxicology. Clara, with her calm precision, had likely perfected the dosage over years. Enough to sicken, enough to kill, never enough to spark suspicion. But why continue? Why risk discovery, marriage after marriage? Hale believed it was because Clara believed herself invincible. Each successful deception hardened her confidence. Each inheritance widened her reach. By 1912, she was not merely playing a role. She was performing a masterpiece, with the veil as her curtain. The most chilling theory was that Clara intended the portrait itself to be a monument to her triumphs, that she wanted to stand immortalized, surrounded by the echoes of those she had conquered, never imagining the same photograph would become her undoing. But no matter her motives, the portrait endured. And in the years that followed, its strange details would resurface again and again, until they reshaped Clara's legacy forever. Time has a way of burying scandals, but it also has a way of unearthing them. After Thomas Whitmore's death, Clara lived comfortably for several more years. She relocated twice, changed her name yet again, and eventually faded from the records. Some claimed she fled overseas. Others whispered she remarried under a new identity. By the late 1920s, she had vanished from public view, leaving behind nothing but whispers and the photograph. The Whitmore portrait remained in the family, though not without unease. Margaret, who never stopped suspecting Clara, kept it wrapped in cloth, stored in the attic rather than displayed. She told her children that the photograph was cursed, that it had captured the truth of a killer. For decades it sat untouched, a relic of both grief and suspicion. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that interest in the portrait revived. A curious descendant, cleaning through family belongings, rediscovered it. The strange faces in the veil had not faded. In fact, with modern photographic techniques, they appeared sharper than ever. By the 1960s, amateur historians were discussing the image in local newsletters. By the 1980s, it had drawn the attention of crime historians, who began piecing together Clara's trail of marriages and deaths. The portrait was no longer just a family heirloom. It became a piece of evidence, one that spanned time. Scholars debated whether the spectral faces were truly reflections of photographs, or simply a trick of exposure. Yet paired with the trail of Clara's past, the image became impossible to dismiss. Forensic advances only deepened the intrigue. In the 1990s, digital enhancement revealed outlines unmistakably resembling men known to have been Clara's previous husbands. Their portraits, preserved in archives, matched eerily with the ghostly visages hidden in the lace. The photograph was now not only a curiosity, but a chilling historical document. By the early 2000s, the image was displayed at a small museum exhibit on photography and the paranormal. Visitors stared, transfixed, at the bride who seemed surrounded by the men she had buried. Some saw it as supernatural proof of spirits lingering. Others recognized it as a forensic accident that had preserved evidence Clara never intended anyone to see. Today, the portrait is studied as both art and artifact. Historians call it one of the eeriest wedding images of the 20th century. True crime enthusiasts hail it as a case where a single photograph revealed a legacy of death. And descendants of Thomas Whitmore, long burdened by the shadow of suspicion, see it as validation of what Margaret always believed. Clara was not an unfortunate widow, but a predator who slipped through the cracks of justice. But beyond evidence, beyond forensics, what remains most haunting is the human cost. The broken families, the stolen lives, and the chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most beautiful smiles. The photograph remains, a frozen moment from 1912, where joy was supposed to live forever. But instead of preserving love, it preserved a truth too dark to ignore. Clara stands there, radiant in lace and veil, yet behind her eyes lies calculation. Around her shoulders, faint as whispers, the faces of the dead. It is easy, more than a century later, to dismiss her as a monster. A woman who used charm as a weapon, who poisoned her way through fortunes and families. But the horror of her story is not just in what she did. It is in how easily she moved unseen. How society, blinded by appearances and expectations, allowed her to hide in plain sight. The portrait is a reminder of human vulnerability. Thomas Whitmore trusted the woman beside him, never suspecting that the vows spoken before God were already poisoned with betrayal. His sister Margaret suspected, but her warnings were brushed aside as worry or jealousy. Even the physician, whose duty was to preserve life, failed to question what seemed improbable, that death could come from the hands of a grieving wife. Clara's story forces us to ask hard questions. How often do we miss the truth because it seems too strange, too impossible? How many photographs, documents, or memories sit quietly in our own families, carrying secrets no one has yet uncovered? And yet, even in the darkness, there is a kind of justice. Clara vanished, but her triumph did not last. The very image meant to showcase her beauty and joy became her undoing. The veil she wore as a symbol of purity instead betrayed her, trapping within it the echoes of lives she had stolen. She may have escaped courts and prisons, but she could not escape history's eye. Today, when people stand before the photograph in museum glass, they do not see a radiant bride. They see a warning, a reminder that evil often hides behind elegance, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing. The story of Clara Whitmore is not just a tale of murder. It is a testament to the power of a single image. A photograph meant to freeze a moment of happiness instead became a mirror of guilt, a canvas where shadows refused to fade. And so, we leave you with a question. When you look back at the photographs in your own family albums, are you certain you know every story they hold? If this story unsettled you, if it made you question the silent power of a photograph, subscribe for more mysteries that history tried to hide. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have seen the truth in Clara's veil? Or would you, like so many others, have been deceived by her smile?